My good evening, Ed Oldham with you once again. Tony Mepham is with us in the studio still. Tony, good evening.
Good evening.
And something a little bit different this evening. We are joined on the phone from the UK by John Finnegan. And John, good evening to you.
Good evening. Good evening, Ed. Good evening, Tony.
Good evening.
All well?
Yes, good in the UK. Yeah,
we're doing all right, thank you. We're doing all right now. John, we've got you on the programme this evening because yourself and your brother are involved as football agents, effectively, and you have been dealing with a young player from the Isle of Man, Dean Pinnington, who's at Wolves, and we're going to be spending the programme, obviously, chatting about Dean and his progress and whatnot, and I think sort of youth football and agents in a sort of wider context. But first off, give us a bit of background about yourself, please, and your brother, and what you guys actually do.
Yeah, certainly, Ed. Yeah, thank you for the invite as well to join the programme this evening. Yeah, we're called New Bart, actually. That's the name of the agency. And it's run by myself and my brother. And we focus on sort of looking after a small sort of niche number of players, mainly in the sort of 14 to 18 sort of category. We have one or two others that are outside of that. So we're really looking at bringing younger players into the UK and also picking up some of those that get dropped out of academies from time to time as these things happen. So we focus on probably 10 to 12 sort of players maximum. Most of our players are 16, 18, 20 maximum. And we look to find them clubs and look after them for the duration of their stay with the club, just like we've done with Dean, really.
So how has Dean become part of your stable? Because in the past it's been quite difficult, hasn't it, Tony, for Manx footballers, young Manx footballers, to get noticed and get away and train with clubs?
Well, I think, to be fair, the reason with Dean's came about was, I think at sort of 7, 8 years of age, everyone knew that Dean had something special, and he was at Corinthians at that time, and it was just a process to see him develop. And there's been no pressure from his dad, Mark, because Mark just goes down, supported his boys, the three of them playing football, but Dean just had that sort of gift, you could tell. And I think I remember, it's quite a few years ago now, because I think Dean's 14, 15 now, was his dad phoned me up and said, you know, Tony, Dean's sort of playing well, everyone's talking about him. He transferred to Uni Mills at that time, and he says, I don't know what to do next. And I said, well, your best person to speak to on the island is Lee Dixon. Now, I don't know whether John's come in contact with Lee, but Lee's got some great connections in England, and there's quite a few players benefited from Lee's knowledge.
So, John, just how did Dean come to you and your brother's attention?
Yeah, well, we did actually make contact with Lee, but the story sort of started like this. There's a little bit of a story to it. Pete's daughter took up a nursing post in Douglas back in 2016, and through various sort of conversations, sort of football related, Pete got invited to meet Lee Dixon and Michael Fitzmaurice, and various sort of meetings and discussions, and then was invited along to see a game where Dean was playing along with a number of other players, and instantly Pete picked out Dean as the standout player, for what it's worth. Just as Tony said, that sort of natural ability, body movement, all those sort of things, it sort of stood out. And we then subsequently talked to Mark and Christine and met the rest of the family, and were invited to try and help find a place for Dean in the UK, which is what we did. So Pete's background is football. He's scouted for Premiership club for 6 or 7 years. He also ran or was a director of a non-league club. So all his history is in football and finding players, whereas I just look after the business side of it. So what then happened was we went out looking for clubs that we felt were the right sort of fit for Dean at his sort of stage and age and so forth. And we basically arranged trials for him at 4 clubs, at Wolves, at Leicester, at West Bromwich Albion, and at Aston Villa, all based in the Midlands. We're a Midlands-based firm. We could have extended it further than that, but we decided to keep it sort of local and compact. And that sort of started, he had trials in 2016 and into 2017. And then that sort of finally culminated in a short list of 2, which was Wolves and Villa. and we arranged final visits to the club for the whole family. That was Mark, Christine, Connor, Danny and Dean, to give them the full sort of gamut of what joining an academy in the UK would be like. And they had a whole day with each club, and as a consequence of that, they decided Wolves was the right club for him, which we totally agreed with. And he basically joined in July 2017, and he actually started with them in September. So that's how he got to where he is, basically. And we had a lot of help along the way through Lee and Pitsy in terms of making that sort of initial contact.
And how has he been progressing then? How's he been doing?
Well, I have to say, I know he's probably listening to this, but he's fitted in really well at Wolves. Obviously, it's a big move to move home and leave your family. And obviously, some of the early days were, a bit of homesickness and so forth. But overall, he's settled in really well. Wolves love him. They've always liked him from the start. You all know him probably better than I do, but he's got a cheeky personality and he fits in well there. And in fact, I think he's just come back off an academy trip to Italy with Wolves, where he took part in a competition out there the last sort of 4 days. So he's fitted in really well. His main coach at under 15 level is an ex Aston Villa and England international, Darius Lascelles. He's in sort of good company there, and fitted into the Wolves setup really well.
Great to hear. And it's funny that John mentions there about the personality. I mean, having that bit of cheek, bit of confidence, bit of chutzpah, if you want to call it that, Tony. I mean, that's vital, really, isn't it?
But it's nice cheek. And I think the good thing about with Dean, because I've watched him for quite a while, is that he's never sort of stepped over that mark. Sometimes you can have a real talent and really, cause themselves a few problems with players on the park by being a little bit cocky or whatever, but he's never been like that. And I know I went down to watch him against Everton, who came over to the Isle of Man. I think it was under 10, something like that, it might have been 11s. He just looked like one of those, and you just thought to yourself, absolutely fantastic. But with Wolves, I know I've spoke to Mark, Dean's dad, and they're absolutely chuffed to bits. The way it's going, yes, he was a little bit homesick, but that's natural. But I think, as John's just said, he's been away to Italy this week. I think he was playing, John, if it was right, under 16s he was playing, wasn't it?
He was, Tony, absolutely correct. So he's already progressing through the sort of Wolves setup. As I say, they see him as a real progressive sort of talent, and he joined the under 16s and was part of that sort of setup. And the other thing, that just to pick on your point, Tony, was that Dean's already giving something back at Wolves. He's only been there 5 minutes, but I know that one of the coaches told us when there's been a training session for under 11s, under 12s, he's actually out helping the coaches in that sort of session. So it's a really great sort of attitude to football, really.
And is he still one of those that's the last person off the pitch? Because I remember whenever there was big games down at the Bowl, you'd always see Dean in the goal, pinging the balls in at half-time, and then at full-time, when the game was over, he was back in the nets again, pinging them in. Is he still like that?
Absolutely. You have to steal the ball off him to get him off there, basically, is what I hear. So I don't think anything like that's changed. He's got desire, he's got tons of determination, obviously ability, which you guys know about and Wolves saw. And what I would say, a really good attitude to football. And we see a lot of players who've got ability, but they don't have the same sort of desire and attitude that we see in Dean, basically.
I think that's something that's been picked up on as well, is his fitness level, because I think that's something that maybe the Isle of Man players have struggled with when they've gone over for trials. They don't seem fit enough, even though they think they are. But Dean seems to be a step above that. Is that right?
It is. I mean, there is a level of fitness that is not obvious until you actually join Wolves is a Category 1 academy, so he's in a top academy. In fact, 2 years ago when they rate academies, Wolves was rated the third best academy. Only the two Manchester clubs were ahead of it. So all those facilities are there. And what they do is, Dean's had one or two niggles as happens. And, they take him out of it. He's on a fitness program with the physios, etc. They won't let him back playing until he's right. And all of that is about, the development of the player at the club. So, the fitness is paramount, really.
And it's a good club to be at, I think, isn't it? It's a club that's on the rise again after a few years in the doldrums. There's been a big injection of money. There's been a high-profile coach with Nuno Espiritu Santo coming in, the George Mendes connection, and some big players coming in as well. This is a team that's very much looking to get back to the top tier of English football.
Yeah, completely. I mean, it's when we took him into Wolves, he did actually meet Paul Lambert, who was the previous manager, as part of that day's sort of meeting, as he did Steve Bruce at Aston Villa, for that matter. But obviously that manager and setup has changed, and certainly Wolves is very much on the up and, very positive. I mean, they're going to push forward, and unless something dramatic happens, they're going to be in the Premiership next year. Hopefully with Aston Villa, it'd be great to see both Midlands clubs in there. Everything looks very positive at Wolves, and good for the future, really.
And there is within the club still that, I mean, you say the academy's great, but within the upper echelons of management, is there still that commitment to youth, which Wolves has very much had in the past with some of the players that it's brought through, like I think Dean Richards and Julian Lescott, for example, a couple like that. Are they still committed to doing that, as well as bringing in the higher profile players from elsewhere in England and overseas?
It's a great question, and obviously with the management change beginning of the season, it was one of the questions that Pete and I asked Mark Campbell, the assistant academy manager, in terms of, he's here, is anything going to change? And, the message we got back was, it's only going to get better. They're still very committed to their young players. And, it's a good example is Dean being taken on the Italy trip, almost a year ahead of his time this week. It's great sort of opportunity for them.
Indeed. And I was going to sort of widen the discussion a little bit, John, because it's rare that we get to speak to someone such as yourself who is involved in football at such a level and with young players of such promise. It must be, in some ways, it's seen as quite a cutthroat industry, isn't it? The sort of gathering of young players by clubs and people being put out on loan a lot, and the stockpiling of players, I think it is known as, and also the work of agents at times can come in for quite a bit of criticism. So it must be difficult for you sometimes to put across the positive image that you want to.
It absolutely is. I mean, we have Pete and I sort of set out to try and be ourselves, and our sort of mantra is, the primary thing for us is the best interest of the player. Anything else is a bonus for us going forward. We are running a business, but we won't just take on any player. And interestingly, what we've learned over the last couple of years, that we're not just taking on a player and looking after him, we're also taking on the family at times. And so when we're looking at players, we're also interviewing the family, because we've got to be able to provide what they want. And if we can't, then we don't take on a player. I mean, Pete will look at a player 2 or 3 times at least before we sort of take somebody on. And that's just our sort of style. We don't deal in high numbers. That's not what we're about. We'll be looking after 10 to 15 players max at any one point in time, and hopefully bringing them on. I describe it as trying to become a footballer or develop as a young footballer. It's a bit like playing snakes and ladders. And we've all done that in our time, and we're all trying to climb up those sort of ladders, and Pete and I have to pick them up when they slip down the stakes sometimes, But it's an interesting and challenging game to be in, but one we enjoy.
And you were talking about taking on the family there. How important is it for you and your brother Peter to see the support network that, the familial support network that a player has behind them?
It's absolutely paramount, because, we've had examples, I won't name names of players where, we've just not really been able to get on the same wavelength as the family members. And, at times parents see a particular sort of outcome for their players, and we don't see it. And, they have to rely on us, and particularly Pete, in terms of understanding the levels in football. But let me say, in terms of the Pennington family, we've had absolute support, and we get on really well with them, and they know that all we're going to be doing is in the best interest of Dean, and hopefully advise them properly along the way.
And Tony, I'll bring you in for this one as well. Obviously, Safeguarding of young people within football is vital these days. Police checks are very, very stringent, along with the qualifications of coaches and people involved in football across the board, youth football across the board. And what didn't used to happen in that sort of respect has been brought very much into sharp focus in the last week or so. Well, very much so. But before that, with this Barry Bennell case, I mean, times have very much changed, haven't they? People are a lot more careful these days, but this is something that is, again, absolutely vital to the development of young people. You're caring for young people as well as trying to help them get to a certain level in football.
100%, and I know I spoke to Mark, I spoke to him today, and he's a real family man, but he doesn't pressurise Dean, and I think that's why they've got the best out of Dean, because sometimes parents can pile too much pressure on, and as you say, for a young lad of 14 to go away like that, and I know Christine and Mark were absolutely gutted to lose one of their sons, but he's in such good hands, and I know Mark thinks so much of John and his brother there looking after Dean, and this is why Dean is producing the goods. And I think probably what some people are thinking is, it can happen, a player can come in, his form can sort of dip. How does it work now with Dean? Because obviously there's education side he's going through at the moment, where he's living. How does it work with him now, and how long could this last for?
Great point, Tony. Wolves, basically what we agreed for the family and for Dean, basically, it was 4 years. Wolves school, Dean, at Thomas Telford School, top sort of secondary school in the Midlands. So that's his schooling covered for. And he lives with a host family in Wolverhampton, who, the parents met, we've met, Wolves look after them, through that sort of system. So he's fed, he's, everything that, a young lad would need growing up is looked after. He's taken to the ground, he's taken to school, etc., etc. And my brother Pete has a sort of saying is that, what you need to do to give a young player a chance is to take all the outside sort of factors away from him so he can just concentrate on football. If he's having to think about this, that and the other and has distractions, then he's probably not going to, deliver on the pitch as well as we could hope for. So part of our job, supporting the parents, is to try and make sure we allow him to concentrate on that. And if we have to deal with things with the club or whatever, or school, then we'll liaise accordingly with them. But that's typically sort of how it works at Wolves. And Wolves are really supportive of Dean, thus far.
And Tony, this is another example, I suppose, for young players in the Isle of Man of the sort of pathway that there can be for them as well. I mean, we've had others going away and doing pretty well. Adam Long, I was thinking of at Wigan, who's really pulling up trees there and doing a great job. But it's, as we see in other sports, particularly with the cyclists which have done it over the last few years, the young kids need to see that living on an island like the Isle of Man is not necessarily a barrier to them chasing their dreams.
No, it isn't. And, Michael Fitzmaurice, Lee Dixon, Paddy Horn, there are others who have played a part in developing Dean into the player that he is. It's in him. So that does help. But I think there is a pathway there, but it's just connecting with the right people. And that's what's happened here with John and Paul. They've connected with people who care about the child, care about the player, and give him what opportunities can. And I think it's important as well is to be honest to the player and to the family. Don't tell them what could happen. Let's and say that it will happen. It's one of those that you've just got to sort of guide them. And if Dean develops like he is doing into a really good footballer, then I think the gate's open naturally anyway. And John with his connections and Pete as well will make sure that it happens for him. But there are some really good footballers on the Isle of Man. When I look at Jack Kamada, we had him on the show recently. Jack was at Preston North End last Thursday and did really well. So we're just waiting to hear and what Jack's just turned 16. So there's some real talent coming through at the moment on the Isle of Man.
And John, you were saying about the education side of things and what's provided for them. It's obviously very important that they continue their schooling until at least 16. But it's also important, really, isn't it, that they develop as individuals, as human beings, that they develop a mental resilience alongside that education, just in case that things don't exactly go their way, or in a worst case scenario, things, really fall apart, that they are able to pick themselves up afterwards and also have some sort of other skills, qualifications and capabilities that they can fall back on.
Completely right, Ed. And Peter, sort of mentors the players that we look after. And, if we detect something that's not quite right, then we'll be looking to try and address it. In the case of Wolves, where Dean's at, he's at Thomas Telford School. It's a really great setup. They've got, they look after a number of footballers. It's part of their agreement with Wolves. And, I know Dean plays for the school, and, the school sometimes takes priority over Wolves games. That's the sort of agreement they have. So they're, very much part and parcel of the whole educational system. And, they've got to do well, and there's no sort of shirking those sort of responsibilities. It's part and part of what you brought into. So I completely agree with you. It's a tough game. Lots of things can happen along the way. You can have great ability and something just might not go right or whatever. So you've got to have a fallback. Completely agree.
What about now that you've got Dean in your camp, the Isle of Man? Is there any connections starting to build? I know Lee and Michael Fitzmaurice are here, so they'll keep you posted. But is there any sort of opportunity for other players who are showing sort of Dean's commitment and ability to speak to you and maybe guide them through something?
Tony, that door's open. It's always open. I mean, we make good connections with Lee and Fitzy, so I think Pete was also talking to Jack Kamada's dad quite recently, because I know he'd sort of been over here for one or two sort of trials. So we're quite happy to continue that. It's been great so far with Dean, and if there are people that you want us to look at, we'll try and help. What we can do clearly is we've got connections. If I look at the players that we look after, just to give you some sort of idea, there's about 10 that we look after constantly at the moment. Two 18-year-olds, both playing for Premiership clubs, Bournemouth and Leicester. Dean, obviously, at the Championship. Another player at League 2, another player at League 1, 3 or 4 in non-league. So, and non-league is a route for some players. We sometimes have to say to players and parents, well, I know you think you might be a Championship player, but the route in to get in the system and to find your way forward, maybe through a conference sort of side, So certainly those opportunities are still there, and we're happy to keep the door open, Tony.
A little bit of a worry at the time when Leicester were sort of looking at Dean is Leicester had just won the league, and everybody then wants to pile on and sort of get into Leicester's academy. And I know deep down that sort of the family put a lot of thought in it, and I'm just delighted that it's gone so well with the connection with yourselves and Wolves, because I think that's why Dean's producing what he's doing at the moment.
I completely agree, Tony. I mean, the Leicester thing, I'd say we introduced 4 clubs. It wasn't right for Leicester, and we agree that, it was the right sort of decision not to sort of progress it further there. Whereas we probably knew right from the start that Wolves had all the sort of things that were important to Dean. I'm a big Villa fan, so when it came to the final shortlist of Wolves and Villa, I'd have loved to have seen him at the Villa, but we completely agreed with the decision that the best place for him was Wolves, and that's how we'll look after players. We will look after their best interests, because it's a tough enough game anyhow for them. So it's really important that they start at the right place.
The next sort of one I would like to see is possibly Dean or some of your players getting the chance to play for, like English schoolboys, because I know we were lucky with Chris Bass Jr., one of our stars of Manx football over recent years, got the chance to play in the under-19s. Is there a way possibly there for Dean at sort of 15, 16 to get into a setup like that?
Well, nothing, no obvious barriers at the moment in the way. I mean, I think what we would say is we like to sort of take it slowly. He's only been there since September. Let him get established. We find that you sometimes mustn't throw too much at them. They're growing still. They get injuries. They get growing pains, etc. But our view, and Pete saw Dean, and he scouted a lot of players over the years, and Dean is right up there at the top of the list of players that Peter's ever scouted. So nothing, at the moment that would stop that sort of progress from our point of view.
Okay, gentlemen, that's pretty much where we're going to have to draw things to a close. John Finnegan, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us this evening. It's been fascinating to get that insight as to what it's like for a young player going across from the island and how you guys are helping him to try and achieve his dreams. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, John.
Thanks for the invite, guys. Good luck.
Cheers. And thank you very much, Tony. Yeah, like I said, very interesting to get that sort of insight, isn't it?
Yeah, it was important. It's been sort of in the making for the last sort of couple of months, and I'm delighted that John gave us the time to come back on and just explain. And what is nice, Dean flew back this afternoon, and I know he's probably listening to our programme with his dad at the moment. And we wish you well, Dean. Everyone in Manx football is behind you, and I'm sure on behalf of Dean, thanks for people like Michael Fitzmaurice, Paddy Horn and Lee Dixon. I know what they've gone through. They've had him in hotel rooms looking after him, this safeguard issues, and they've been an absolute credit to Dean, and I'm sure on behalf of Dean, well done to those three and anyone else involved.
Thanks very much, Tony. That's it for Friday Football, folks.